Hello. At the end of the last video, you may recall me talking about those times in the school year when it seems that enthusiasm for learning and for what we're doing in the classroom is at its lowest ebb. That students almost seem to sit back in their chairs and say, "Come on, teach me, I dare you." Well, that lethargy, that loss of focus and intensity can occur for some very understandable reasons. The students may simply be worn out, such as maybe they're in the midst of a period of tournament basketball and everyone's going to the games at night and everyone's getting home late. It could be like here in Michigan that we're in the midst of the month of February, where winter seems to be interminable and everyone has cabin fever and we're just sick of it, and it's hard to generate much enthusiasm. But this lethargy, this loss of enthusiasm for what's going on in class can occur for some very important reasons, and reasons which are very much within our control. When that occurs in my classroom, when I see students enter my classroom with a look on their face that suggests that they're expecting the routine, and that routine is going to be useless. Do you remember that term, useless? Oh, in the last video, I talked about students of mine teaching English overseas right now, and that on 3 occasions they talk about the useless education that the students in English had received prior to their inheriting them, and how these students had head knowledge but were totally incapable of actually expressing themselves. Well, students here in America can get that sense too. They get that sense that the education they're receiving is useless, and that it's not going to lead to the ability to actually relate in this new language that they're purportedly learning. Well, when that occurs, and the students' enthusiasm inevitably drops, and their attitude toward the class becomes almost sullen, I look to see if one of 4 elements is missing from my program. I call them the 4 pillars of world language education. If one of these 4 is missing, things are going to be shaky in class. If 2 are missing, my program is going to just crumble. And so what are these 4 elements? First of all, I look at the very simple matter of curriculum. Does the curriculum that we are using respect the natural language acquisition sequence? Now, I defined this sequence in video number 2. And in that video, I talked about a natural order to the learning of one's native language proceeds from from years spent, but in the classroom, it'll be months of speaking and listening. Actually, listening first and then speaking. Listening and speaking. In my classroom, this will go on for several months before the students are ever introduced to the written word at all. And then once they have attained what I defined in video number 3 as relative oral fluency, they're ready to be exposed to phonics instruction and then to elementary reading as well, without neglecting the skills of listening and speaking. I never want to drop those. And then finally, typically after almost a year of primarily oral interaction, I'm ready to expose my students to the skill of writing. So you see that order right there, from listening and speaking to reading, significantly later to reading, to much later to writing. If it is not respected in our curriculum, our students will start to develop that 5-step thought process that leads to unwieldy, awkward, slow speech, such as I just explained in video number 1. And students, they're not ignorant. They understand. They can tell what's happening to them. They can tell that they're incapable of actually expressing themselves in speech to a classmate or to you as well. And at that, they get the sense at that point that their education is useless. So first, I look to see, is the curriculum that I'm using, is it respecting their natural language learning sequence? Students can accept a language class in which reading and writing is proving to be a challenge for them to learn. But they will not forgive a teacher, and they'll not accept a language course in which they are aware that they're becoming totally incapable of ever actually speaking this language, and that there's no likelihood that any change is forthcoming. Not long ago, I received this email from a former student of mine telling about a summer mission project in which she participated. Now, having exclusively studied under the ULET program while she was in high school, this meant that she'd spent, actually in her class, it was an entire year and a half before ever being exposed to the written word. And once I'd laid the solid oral foundation in her mind and in the mind of her classmates, I was able to proceed to reading and writing with great ease. Because, and here's the key, she already knew how the language was supposed to sound before she ever dealt with it in printed form. And therefore teaching reading and writing was exceedingly easy. Well, let me read this email to you and see what you can glean regarding the sense of satisfaction that she experienced because her instruction had respected the natural language acquisition sequence. She wrote, "I wanted to tell you about how much my Spanish training has already come in handy this summer. I went on a mission trip a few weeks ago, and one of the girls on my mission team is from Costa Rica. I found that it was very natural for me to be able to converse with her, and we could understand each other very well. She later told me that I am the first high school student that she has been able to have a real conversation with, which was very special to me. For that, I have to say thank you." Well, when the student said that the ability to actually speak with this Costa Rican girl was very special to her, in essence, what she's saying is the education I received has been useful. This education, which has respected the natural language acquisition sequence, has resulted in my ability to actually communicate with somebody whom I would not have potentially known otherwise. Now, does delaying exposure to the written word until a sound oral foundation of relative oral fluency has been laid, does delaying exposure to the written word mean that in the long run these students trained under this method are going to be somewhat deficient in the skills of reading and writing? Nothing could be farther from the truth. Let's take a look at this email written by a student in her first year of college Spanish, as she reflects back on the consequences, the results of the training she received under the ULAT program. "Since I learned to speak first, you'd think I wouldn't do as well in writing. But I think learning to speak first only made my writing more logical and flow better." Speaking about her college classmates, she added, "Sometimes we would peer edit each other's papers in class, and people would use sentences in their papers that made no sense. They were using some of the right words, but in the incorrect order, and it was actually pretty confusing and frustrating." Well, her writing was more logical and flowed better because of the way in which she'd been trained to think as she speaks this new language, and a two-step thought process, and because of the oral emphasis and the respecting of the natural language acquisition sequence that occurred in her high school training. She already knew, and this is the key, she already knew what the language should sound like before she ever learned how to put it in, or transcribe it into written form. The best chance of success both in reading and writing expression depends upon having laid a strong oral foundation in our students so that they know how the language should sound, which gives them the ability to predict. That's the ability to anticipate a word's meaning and anticipate its proper pronunciation when encountering that word in written form for the first time. Well, that's the first of the 4 pillars. That is to say, does my curriculum respect the natural language acquisition sequence? Secondly, the second pillar that needs to be in place if student enthusiasm and interest is to remain high is the issue of relationship. Am I providing my students with the opportunity to relate to native speakers of this language that we're learning in such a way that my students sense that the application of their learning goes beyond the American classroom, the walls of the American classroom? In other words, is learning this new language that I'm trying to convey to them, is it just some kind of an arcane academic game which is being carried out among native speakers of English who could very easily relate to each other in English, as opposed to employing this or handicapping ourselves with this new language? Because that's the elephant in the room. It's the fact that the students know very well that the teacher, as well as all of their classmates, are quite capable of interacting with them in English. And so we need to find a way to expose them. Just like I had, prior to my senior year of high school, the chance to go and live with a French family in northern France during the course of the summer. We need to give our students the opportunity to enter into relationships with native speakers of the language they're learning so that their intensity will heighten because they recognize the importance of this tool, the skill that they're acquiring, because now they know people actually use it. Well, in my classroom, I tried to use, I loved it if students, of course, would go and spend, like I did, their summer in a French or Spanish-speaking country. However, I couldn't depend upon that taking place for all of my students. So during the year, I used online international classroom exchange programs, which allowed me to pair up students with a classroom overseas, where they would be matched up one-on-one with a student in another classroom, and where my classroom would interact as a group with students from another classroom in the country where the target language was the native language. My students would send emails back and forth, and before they could actually read and write, they would record their voice talking about their lives. They'd record the voice in the form of a sound file. They'd attach that sound file to an email, and they'd send it to their correspondent overseas. They made PowerPoint presentations, which were just replete with photos, pictures of themselves, and in which they spoke in simple English. They typed in simple English about themselves and received the same kind of PowerPoint presentations in return from their partners. They couldn't necessarily read all that was written, but the very fact of seeing these images reminded them that this is a real person overseas for whom this language I'm learning is their native language. We conducted video conferencing activities with the classroom overseas as well, finding creative ways to work around the whole issue of the time change when that was a problem. So the first pillar, of course, is curriculum. It's got to be a curriculum which is consistent with how people actually learn their native language as they're learning a second. Secondly, relationship. My students have to enter into relationship with people who speak this target language, this language that we're learning. And then thirdly, I need to employ in the classroom to keep interest high, to keep enthusiasm from waning. The gift, really, it's a gift given to us, you might say, of storytelling. Everyone loves a good story. People the world over and of all ages love to hear a good story. And so the strategic use of videos in the target language to stimulate conversation is an important third pillar of any world language program. I say videos. It can be, later on, it can be, of course, written literature as well. With my students, I do a number of activities as I show them a video. I show them an excerpt of the video, and then we'll go back and I'll stop the video at a key frame regarding some important element of the story, and I'll have them, for oral participation points, by the way, I'll have them describe for me what's taking place in the scene that they see on the screen in the front of the classroom, or I'll ask them questions about what's happening, or very likely there are times when I will have them try to tell the story on the basis of these images, and it can be very humorous how far off track they can get trying to understand what's actually taking place in the story. But the key is not that they be accurate initially at relaying the plot. The key is that my students are, as they try to convey what's happening in the video, they're practicing these linguistic skills that I want them to be practicing, with which I want them to become at ease. When I'm with the more advanced students, of course, we can use literature. Here you see at the ulat.com website that if I click on lessons and then choose a language, we'll take Spanish in this instance, and then go to the bottom of the table of contents, it says video and book studies. I'll go to the video and book studies which are appropriate for public schools this time. And let me enter in my password here. If I click on, let's take El Principito, Le Petit Prince, The Little Prince, and chapter 15, you see that students are, as we talk about the story, they're presented with a simplified summary of the contents of the particular chapter that we've just read in its original version. And the new vocabulary is defined for them, actually in Spanish. No English is used whatsoever. And then in the second section, they have to try to come up with the vocabulary from the first section, which completes this same summary, the same description. And then the third section, they're given questions to which we discuss these questions together, although they could they could write the answers as well. And these questions are questions on the level of observation and interpretation as what's happening within the particular episode or chapter. But most importantly, this next section I think is the most important. Aplicar en la vida, application questions. Questions that allow the student to bring that information down to the level of their own personal lives. What it has to do with them personally and how they would respond in such and such a situation. So this is one way in which we use storytelling to develop students' linguistic abilities in the ULAT. So, if enthusiasm seems to be waning among my students, I ask myself if one of these first three pillars is missing from my program. Is my curriculum failing to respect the natural language acquisition sequence and thereby imparting to my students a useless form of head knowledge regarding this language that should be a practical tool that they can use in the real world? Secondly, are my students failing to experience relationship with native speakers of this language that they're learning, and therefore they fail to see its applicability to their life? Thirdly, am I failing to infuse a sufficient amount of storytelling into the class to maintain interest? And then fourthly, this fourth pillar, if the first three are in place, almost invariably the fourth one will be as well. However, it is nonetheless the most important single tool that a teacher has to ensure that his or her students will eventually attain a certain degree of fluency. And that is simply oral participation. Now I say simply because it would seem natural that it's a given, that it's a regular part of every world language teacher's classroom experience. However, I'm talking about an intensive level and a 100% target language exposure to oral participation. I want students, when they enter my classroom, to be, at least figuratively speaking, on the edge of their seats as class discussions are taking place, because they recognize that I'm going to be holding them accountable for their engagement, their involvement in class discussion. I want there to be a healthy tension in the classroom that drives them to participate in class discussion. And I want them to see every class period as a testing situation, because I'm very objectively and accurately recording their participation in class discussion. And therefore they see themselves again as being accountable for what's going on at all moments of a class. Doesn't sound very relaxing for a student, does it? Well, I confess that I don't really want it to be. At the end of the last video, you may remember I talked about this lethargy when students can sit back and say, come on, teach me, I dare you. Well, I want as a teacher to get the weight off of my shoulders for carrying the class, and I want to get it onto the students' shoulders. I want them to carry the weight, and I do it for a very sound pedagogical reason. And that pedagogical reason is expressed in this very folksy proverb: you can't steer a car until it's moving. I want students to first regularly open their mouth and be willing to speak so that I can start to guide them toward more refined speech as time goes by, and concurrently so that they themselves can become much more at ease with actually speaking this language. Now, how do you do it? How do you motivate students to regularly involve themselves in class discussion? Well, I do it in two ways primarily. First of all, I try to take whatever we study, whatever the vocabulary topic or the grammatical structure we're studying, and bring it down to the level of the students' personal lives, into something that matters to the students in their own lives. For example, when we study the present progressive tense, we won't just study the grammatical concept, although I will model for them the form of the statement and lead them by means of images and sound, as you may have seen the ULAT program, to forming the statements correctly, and then I'll reinforce to the point where the use of the present progressive is a linguistic reflex. Nonetheless, that's not where I end. That's only the beginning point for this grammatical study. My goal is to bring it down to the level of for example, what are your family members doing at this very moment? What are your closest friends doing at this very moment? And asking that question and first modeling, talking about my own family, invariably my students are going to be using this structure, the present progressive tense, as they respond to that question. And when we study vocabulary about daily routine, for example, I'll talk to the students about my own daily schedule, what I do, and I'll tend to illustrate my comments with images, pictures that I've taken at home of myself going through the activities of my daily routine. And we'll talk about, if I had the opportunity, what would I change in my daily routine with which I'm not particularly content? Or when we're studying object pronouns, I'll ask them, what is it that you really appreciate about your parents, or your siblings, or your best friends? And they'll invariably be obliged to use object pronouns in the course of their responses. They'll say things like, oh, they listen to me, or they buy me clothes, or they really understand me. Well, this personal focus keeps the students interested in sharing, and also very significantly in listening to one another as conversation is going on. Like I said, typically I first share about myself to set an example, illustrate with photos when I can to maintain interest, and then I turn to the students and have them tell me. And of course, when they're telling me, they're also conscious that the more they speak, the more beneficial it'll be for their grade. Now, I'm conscious of their grade, but I'm thinking of it on another level. I'm thinking the more they speak, the more at ease they're becoming with speaking. And the more they're practicing these linguistic skills I want them to have, these linguistic reflexes that I've built into them, and the more they're going to be able to speak with fluency as time goes by. Now, the second means of motivating students, actually obliging students to engage in oral participation, revolves again around the word accountability. I have systems set up in my instruction whereby students, they're quite forceful, somewhat draconian, where students are obliged to participate if they intend to pass my class. I weight the oral component in the determination of a student's grade very, very heavily, and particularly in the first year of instruction. Here's a chart that shows you how I weight the different elements of a student's grade. So you can see that fully 50% of a student's grade in the first year is determined by their oral participation in my classes. That's a very heavy weight to give to one single element of a student's performance, but there's no element more important, especially in the first year, than that which describes a student's ease with using the language, and which requires a student to speak the language on a regular basis if they're to succeed in my classes. One might think that oral participation is a subjective consideration, and therefore wonder whether or not it should be weighted so heavily. But as you'll see in just a moment, as I present to you the oral participation evaluation spreadsheet, that the way in which I approach oral participation is anything but subjective. And then you can see in the second, third, and fourth years that a more balanced approach is taken between the different elements of a student's performance in class, although oral participation remains a significant factor. You've heard me say that I keep very accurate, very precise records regarding student performance in class as far as their oral participation is concerned. This is how I do it. First of all, I have this oral participation and record-keeping spreadsheet, which you see here before you. It's actually composed of two sides with identical information on both sides. Therefore, there's room for, as you see here, there is room for 3 classes on this side and 3 classes on the other. Where it says student 1, student 2, student 3, of course, you'd enter the names of the different students in your class. At the top of each class, you see a key there that indicates the kinds of symbols which are placed in these rectangles for each student. An A would be an absence, a T is a tardy, E indicates the student was excused during the class for whatever reason. And then a horizontal line indicates that this negative behavior, the student interrupted class in some fashion. And then, of course, there are hash marks that are placed in each one of these rectangles as the students participate orally in the course of class discussion. I actually don't manipulate this spreadsheet myself. I put it onto a clipboard after I photocopied it. Every day there's a new sheet, and I give the clipboard and the sheet to one of the students in the class, and they're the ones who actually record the information for me. This task of record keeping goes from student to student to student, so it's always a different student each day who's doing the record keeping. And I've never had any problem as far as any sense that records were not being kept accurately. So that's the first step. When the day is finished, I take this spreadsheet, or I should say I take this sheet on the clipboard, and I go to the spreadsheet I'm about to show you now and record or transfer all of this data. Okay, as I mentioned, I take that information off of the record-keeping sheet and I transfer it to this oral participation and evaluation spreadsheet. Now, this spreadsheet is was extremely complex to create because of all the formulae located behind many of the cells. However, as far as using it for you, the end user, is extremely simple to use. Now, because of the limitations of time in this video, I'm not going to go into the setup and the use of this spreadsheet. However, you can find within the teacher's manual, directly after the link where you can download this spreadsheet if you're interested, you can find a video that explains exactly how to set it up and how to use it on a daily basis. I'll just show you the kinds of information that it contains. First of all, I should point out that this is one class of up to 39 students. I hope you never have that many students. But there are 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I believe. Yes, there's room for 6 different classes to be recorded on this spreadsheet. And you see that over here there's a little comment indicator for each cell where you have information that you need to enter. This is where you insert class period. This cell indicates that you put the course name within this location. This is how many students are located in the class or are found in the class. And that's extremely important because the expectation as to a student's oral participation is going to be impacted by the number of students in the class, of course. Here we record the student's name. This is optional. You can indicate if the student was excused during the course of the class for any reason. Also optional is indicating whether or not the student interrupted class in any fashion. So negative participation is indicated here. This is also optional. If the unauthorized use of English or of the native language of the student was used in class, you can indicate the quantity of times that occurred here. Thereafter, this is just an explanation of the data. This is nothing that you have to enter yourself. It's all automatically entered. This is where the grade will appear. The student's percentage up to 100% will appear. Over here you see where you actually enter on a daily basis the information regarding the student's oral participation. This is where you put the month of the year in numeric fashion, 9 for September, 10 for October. This is where you put the day, the actual date, the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th of the month. And then down below is where you put the total amount of student contributions orally in the course of the class. Then to the far, let's see if I can scroll over here, to the far right, but the student's name, by the way, will appear automatically, as I'll show you in a second, in this cell right here. But to the far right is where you enter absences, and all you need to enter is the fact that the letter A, indicating the student was absent on that particular day. And again, the date and the month will automatically appear after you've already entered them to the far right. So let me just show you what this would look like with let's just create a fictional class right here. This is first I think it's the period of the day. That's correct. So let's say it's first period. And this is going to be the class. This is, whoops, I'm going down one more here. There we go. Insert course name. I'll call it Spanish 1. And then this is where I entered the quantity of the number of students. Let's just choose a very small class, 5 students. Must be a private school. So here we are. I'll put some students' names in here. Bill, Mary, Susan, Phil, and Joe. So I'm going to indicate now that this is let's say it's the beginning of the school year. So this is 9 for September. If you want to just save some time, you can fill across for future days as the month of September. Here I'm going to enter the first day. Let's say it's the 7th of September, not the 76th, the 7th. And that's the 8th. I can go ahead and fill certain ones out to save a little time. There's the first week of school, and this is the second week of school, etc. Okay, now I've entered the days of the year. Now let's just say I've completed my first day of classes, and I have this sheet that I've just shown you a little while ago, the record-keeping sheet. And next to me, I simply go right down the column here under the 7th of September and indicate how many times each of these students participated in class discussion, and we'll just leave it right there. You notice how the grade automatically begins to appear. Now, poor Susan is already failing the class. Why is that? Well, she had no oral participation whatsoever. That's because she was absent that day. So what do I do if she was absent? I go straight across to the section that deals with absences. Here's Susan. You can see how the numbers have already transferred over, so we have all the dates already entered in this section. We go to Susan, and we just put in the letter, a capital A. And now let's go back and see what that has done for us. That indicates that under cumulative absences, she has missed 1/3 of a class discussion. I won't go into detail why it's I should say 3/10. I won't go into detail as to why it's 3/10 and not 1. That will be explained to you, the video explaining both setup and use of this spreadsheet. But you can see she has no grade up to this point. Well, this is how, therefore, I keep as accurate and precise records as I possibly can regarding student oral participation. I do it for two reasons. One, I want it to be very clear. I want there to be no doubt that my grade, which is very heavily weighted for oral participation, is absolutely objective. There's no subjectivity whatsoever involved. And then secondly, I want students to have no doubt either about the fact that it is absolutely indispensable to be involved on a regular basis, opening their mouths and speaking, contributing in class, if they are to succeed in my class. So intelligent curriculum which is developed in such a way that it respects the natural sequence by which people learn their language. Relationships with native speakers of the language which we're learning in class. The use of storytelling and the insistence upon active oral participation in class. Those are the four pillars on which any effective world language program needs to rest. If ever interest is waning in my classes, I ask myself, which of these four areas am I most likely neglecting on a daily basis? Well, this is the end of this 4-video series on effective world language instruction. And I just would like to return to what I said when we began in the very first video. I said that language learning is about opening doors to the possibility of relationships with people whom one could not otherwise know without the learning of this new language. It's incumbent upon us as world language teachers to throw out all presuppositions regarding how language should be taught if we recognize that the status quo is actually closing doors for our students to the possibility of relationships, of meaningful relationships carried out in this target language. You know, for those of us who are just interested in picking up a paycheck, I suppose why not just throw a first-year student another grammar packet and occupy them for a significant period of class time. But I highly doubt that describes very many of us in this profession. I think most of us deeply are concerned that our students would have the same kinds of rich experiences with this new language that we ourselves have enjoyed, either through our studies overseas or living overseas, or just knowing people who speak this language here within our own nation. So I'd encourage those of you who are sincere about wanting your students to share in these rich experiences that you and I have known, to open your mind to the possibility there might be another way to go about language teaching. René Descartes put it this way: if you would be a real seeker after truth, it is necessary that at least once in your life you doubt, as far as possible, all things. You know, I don't know about all things, but I do know that in my own teaching career, joy and satisfaction only came after I rejected the traditional means by which I had been taught language back in the 60s and 70s, and that with an open mind I consider how is it that people truly learn language. You know, in the first video, you may remember that I told the story about my first baseman on my baseball team in France, who was the son of the prefect of the north of France, and how my family invited him to spend some time with us in the United States. And before we could take him to the States, I had to first go to the apartment in the prefecture and meet his father, so his father could kind of judge whether or not I was a trustworthy individual. You know, as I was making that video, I had one problem. I needed a photo of the prefecture to illustrate about what I was speaking, illustrate the fact this is a rather extravagant, glorious looking bit of architecture, and which also suggested the kind of a powerful individual I was going to speak with. The problem is I could find pictures online, but I didn't have the confidence that I would be able to use them necessarily legally. So as I was making that video, out of the blue, you might say, I received some photos from a very old and good friend in France named Philippe. We became close friends with Philippe during the 13 years that we lived in the north of France. And one of these photos that he sent me, he sent them just, as you'll see in a second, with the notion of friendship in mind, and to remind us of the city where we had become close friends with him. One of these photos was of the prefecture. More than ironically, Philippe was totally unaware of my need of that very photo to complete my work in that first video. Try and figure out the probability of that happening. In any case, on the back of the photo, he'd written these words. This photo, taken on July 14th, is, now the expression here is literally would have the sense of a nod to, but the idea is a tribute. a tribute to Franco-American friendship. This photo, taken on July 14th, is a tribute to Franco-American friendship. It's in Lille. It's especially because of my thankfulness toward all of you in the Nesbitt family who live in my heart. That is what language learning is all about. It's about the relationships with people whom we can touch and who can touch our own lives and influence our lives as well. Are you taking risks in your pedagogy and thereby opening doors to such relationships for your students? Are you playing it safe and closing doors and also closing your students' minds to the possibilities of actually relating to other individuals with these languages? I invite you to investigate the ULET program. It's just one means. Undoubtedly there are others, but this is one means of transforming your own teaching experience and your students' lives. Thank you very much for those of you who've joined me and having thought this through. What a privilege it is to have this amazingly powerful role, the role of world language educator. We need to carry it out with a full assurance that what we are doing is not for our facility, but is for our students' well-being.